So we've been talking a lot over the last couple of days about this intersection or even collision of two very different worlds, the IT world, computing, data, cognitive, and the bioscience world. Well, I think everyone in this room understands there are very big differences in the business models in those two worlds. What we see in IT is what's known as Moore's Law. Geometric improvements in quality, computational ability at ever lower prices, to the point where we now all carry around in our pocket what used to be considered a supercomputer and sell for $1 billion. And yet in healthcare, we often see the opposite. Prices seem to go up steadily, several times the rate of inflation, and often at rates that are hard to justify based on increases of quality. So what we're going to do now is have a conversation focusing particularly on drug prices, and can this collision that we've been talking about start to bring the benefits of Moore's Law to healthcare? And we have three great doctors to have this conversation. I'd invite them out now. First of all, Peter Bach from Memorial Sloan Kettering, Steve Miller from Express Scripts, and Vijay Pandey from Andreessen Horowitz. Gentlemen, come on out. Peter, why don't you...
You're supposed to go.
I know, but he told me.
Oh, really?
You're wrong.
You do what Sasha says.
Exactly.
Don't do what Alex says. Yeah.
Exactly.
So thank you, all three of you, for being here. And Peter, I'm going to start with you. We all know that Americans pay exorbitant prices for drugs, like orders of magnitude more than anybody else in the world. And what I've always been told, at least, is that what we get in return for that is innovation. But let me ask you, is there a clear connection between drug pricing and drug innovation?
Very hard to know, right? And so just to talk about Moore's Law, or sort of one over Moore's Law, what we see in healthcare today and in drug pricing, it's difficult to measure the sort of magnitude of the improvement like we can in computer processing power. But, every analysis we've looked at, if you look at things like, how much does it cost when a new drug comes on the market for an incremental year of life that it produces, the inflation on that over the last 20 years has been about 5-fold. So new drug coming on the market 20 years ago is $50,000 per life year. Today it's about $250,000 per life year. We see that
the inverse of Moore's Law.
Right. It's like E-Room's law or something.
E-Room.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so
more spelled backwards.
Yeah,
if you didn't get
it's
it.
pretty good. 4 cups of coffee later. That kind of inverse, we see it in other sectors as well. The cost of lowering LDL by 1 milligram, hypercholesterolemia, has gone up about 18-fold, dollars for inflation adjusted with the new PCSK9s compared to their traditional statins when they launched treatments for cystic fibrosis, per incremental improvement of about 3-fold in price per unit of benefit. So we see the inverse. And of course, we have drugs like Gleevec, which cost 3 times as much today as they did 15 years ago, that do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But the hard question is, the retort is always, look, we need high prices to drive innovation, and what we can't see is, what does that return curve look like? Where does the innovation move up relative to each dollar we spend? Because we can see we're spending much, much more.
And it's less clear that we're getting the return. So, Steve, I covered these debates in Washington. The folks in Washington who have argued against regulating prices, against allowing Medicare to negotiate directly with the drug companies, because that's effectively the same thing as regulation, have said we can create a marketplace that will give you a fair price quality trade-off. You're right. Express Scripts is right in the middle of that. Is it working?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. If you think about it, the system is not sustainable. America is 4.6% of the world's population. We're about 40% of world drug spend. We are somewhere between 50 and 70% of pharmaceutical profitability. We fund all innovation for the world. So we have 300 million Americans paying for healthcare innovation in a world that has 600 million people that live a Western style, that has equal incomes. And so the Canadians, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Australians are all getting a free ride based on U.S. consumers.
But Steve, based on what Peter said, we're not just funding all innovation for the world. We're funding something else because we're not getting the innovation return for the huge amounts of money we're putting into it.
Oh, no, I think, what we call innovation is actually innovation and profitability. So it's return to shareholders.
Yeah.
And so we have broke this social contract. Historically in healthcare, providers did not gouge. And so we're seeing a different ethos now where we're actually taking advantage of prices. And so we're actually had great shareholder returns for pharmaceutical and biotech, but right now that's much under challenged.
So Vijay, I mean, people in the IT world like profits too.
Absolutely.
But for some reason we get this inverse trade-off where we get steadily increasing computing power at lower prices. Is there any hope as we come to this intersection of the two technologies that the benefits of Moore's Law can be moved to the healthcare space?
I think what we're seeing is really a change in how we think about what even is a drug. And it reminds me actually a lot of the early days of Genentech and Amgen when people were looking at biologics as therapeutics. And the reaction there was like, oh, this protein can't be a drug. And there were concerns, which many were valid, but we have many biologics now. The change that we're seeing now is not the protein revolution as a therapeutic, but digital therapeutics. And similarly, there are concerns, but what is exciting to me is that there's this potential that we have data that in many diseases, especially behavioral diseases, that in my mind, a drug in terms of small molecules shouldn't be plan A. That if someone has type 2 diabetes, they could get metformin, or they could get a behavioral approach which computation can greatly scale and reduce the cost, and can ride on Moore's Law. And so I think it's a mistake to sort of think about Moore's Law as a panacea for drug design, but there are new opportunities to think about what a drug would be, what a therapeutic would be, or how we can go into traditional drug design as well.
Steve, do you see those in your business? Do you see the benefits yet? Do you think they're within the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, the reality is the reason drug prices keep going up is because you actually can't compare drugs against each other. If you take lab testing, we were talking about this earlier this morning, the tests keep coming down in price. And the reason is that consumers actually assume all the tests are equal. That may not be true, but they don't have a way to compare it, so they make that assumption. In drug studies, we purposely go out of our way to prove that each drug is slightly different, which means I can't arbitrage against them. So I'll give you the one example of real success. We knew that the hepatitis drugs, curative drugs, had equal cure rates at 96%. In that particular case, we were able to arbitrage against them. We drove the price down, and it's the only example where a specialty drug is cheaper in America now than it is in Europe. But it's a rare opportunity we can do this. And so when you talk about digital medicine, how am I going to compare digital medicine against traditional pills?
The market doesn't work.
The market doesn't work.
But the beautiful thing is that we can do that just like we would do in a clinical trial. So let's take type 2 diabetes. And so I'm on the board of Omada Health, which is a digital therapeutic company for type 2 diabetes. And they can look at efficacy in the same way that you would a drug and compare efficacy over time. And the part that I found very dramatic was that their efficacy was not just comparable to metformin, but actually exceeded metformin. And this is something now where we can ask these very same questions about outcomes and about value. And I think this is part of what we're seeing in the ACA and more broadly is that we care about the outcomes, we care about value. And this is where digital therapeutics can compete head on in this specific area.
Yeah, I think if you can actually get the data and the trials are set up so they are comparable groups, and this has been the Achilles heel, is that every cancer trial is on a slightly different population and comparability is very difficult.
Yeah, so just to go ahead, Al.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask you, how do we fix this? I mean, it's incredibly perplexing, and we've been having these debates for many, many years. How do we create a marketplace so the benefits of computation can actually flow through?
Yeah, well, all right, so a couple of things. One is, I'm always hesitant when people say, the market's broken, right? Like markets, the traditional laws in markets are not supposed to achieve social goals necessarily, right? They're supposed to create wealth, but it's not necessarily even supposed to be homogeneously distributed, right? In fact, it isn't the goal of capitalism to raise the wealth of everyone at the kind of the same level. And so the market actually works perfectly, right? To the extent that, like all laws of supply and demand, there's a lot of people who don't get the good because it's being cleared at a price that many people can't afford or don't value enough. So we should dispense with this discussion that markets are going to solve this problem. Markets have gotten us where we are, right? And so, but
Well,
the other...
but if Steve's right, if you can't compare two drugs, then the market doesn't work. If people are paying large increments for drugs that aren't sufficiently better, then there's an information problem in the market.
Well, I mean, the problem there, the classic failure is monopoly power, right, which the government grants to protect innovators, right? So we can't sort of, unless we're going to strip that away as well, we should expect this exact kind of failure. So the problem is with finding the right price, and I think that requires a completely different way of thinking about prices, which is that drugs should be based on what they do for patients, their prices. But I actually was going to make a different point. It's true, on the digital side, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about big data, but what we're lacking right now is even the most basic availability of data involving humans on trials that are locked within proprietary databases. So even people like me who think about things statistically, we can't even get individual level patient data from trials that have been approved by the FDA and drugs that are going into people so that we can take those individual data and do the exact comparability trials that Steve is asking for. We're completely hamstrung by that, and there's some movement towards opening up those data resources, but that's an easy sort of low-hanging next step to generate a lot more information than we have.
You're nodding, VJ.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that data would be something where it is not just about populations, but behavior over time. And that's, I think, a part that people often miss is that, if you take an individual test, like a PSA test, that may tell you something or it may not, but if you can watch someone's PSA over time, the sort of example that came up in the popular press recently was Ben Stiller, that he actually had prostate cancer, but his PSA test was never so high that any given marker would suggest he should do something about it. But having that longitudinal data on him was key. If we could access that for everybody, we could make much better decisions for people in a much more enlightened way.
So Andreessen Horowitz is in this to make money. Where are you seeing, and presumably over some reasonable time period, where do you see the opportunities that the marketplace will allow you to make money off of in the next 5 years?
Speaking to the topic of this forum, Moore's law really means that the cost of compute has been going to zero exponentially. That's really a dramatic thing. In my work, I founded the Folding Home Distributed Computing Platform. We get a Guinness World Record for the most powerful computer in 2007. Now that compute is like a couple $100s a day. It's something where something goes from impossible to free. And this is not just even in compute. The price of storage is declining this way, and the price of a human genome is going this way. It's gone from $3 billion to $3 million to soon to be perhaps $300. And that's really the unique opportunity for this time. And so the question is, will startups be able to innovate in this space to combine advances in genomics and in machine learning, which comes from compute and from storage, and do something that actually has real impact in the market?
But will you? I mean, don't we have to figure out some way for these two fields to come together?
Well, one place that we're seeing immediately is in, for example, in clinical tests, where a doctor orders a test, and they're not thinking about how does the lipid panel work or how, let's say, a cancer test might work. They just want to know what the data is and what the results are. But baked into the test could be genomics, could be machine learning, could be leveraging all the data that we want to have. This is something that would work within the system, but yet would be taking advantage of all these new technologies.
So I want to go back to the drug pricing issue for just a minute, because we're about a few days away from an election. Mm-hmm. I think there's, and I think, I'm not going to ask you how you're going to vote, but I think in the wake of these scandals we've had, starting with Valiant and then Shkreli and then the Mylan EpiPen, there's going to be enormous pressure. Really, whoever gets elected, there's going to be enormous political pressure to say, screw this, we tried it. We want Medicare to be able to negotiate directly with drug companies, which I think effectively means we're going to regulate drug prices like everybody else in the world. Good idea or bad idea?
Not fully fleshed out, so very hard to gauge. But the fact that there's no...
So you're saying it would be a good idea if they did it right?
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with there being a Medicare buy-in plan for prescription drugs, which is what the whole discussion is about, negotiation, just like there should probably be a public option in the exchanges.
Good idea or bad idea?
So it's a bad idea right now for the following reason. If you think about it, if it's not a matter of who's negotiating the price, that is, these are the same people that negotiate for toilet seats and hammers for the U.S. government. They haven't shown themselves to be the greatest negotiators. The bigger problem is, do they want a narrow formulary and take away choice? You can get really good prices like the VA does because the VA has one beta blocker available. And so they give entire market share to a pharmaceutical company. What Medicare has is a situation where they allow every single drug to be on the formulary, and there's no reason for a pharmaceutical company to give them a better price just because the government's negotiating. So they actually have to be able to do formulary management, narrow choices, and will people want that? You know, that's a big trade-off.
Well, you know, when we think about prices, we could think about the specific question of the price of a drug, or we can talk about the price of care more globally, and that's what we really care about. And the shift to value versus fee for service, I think, will be huge. Because if you incent people for service, what are you going to get? You're going to get a lot of services. If you incent them for care, that would actually be aligning the incentives better. And so I think that's a great first step that we have made. And now the question is, how will things shake out?
But can that be done by Medicare? Can that be done through the government, or will the government prevent that from happening?
No, well, CMS and that is very much, you know, being pushed immediately, and I think that's a very positive thing. And now the question is, how does that trickle down into the specifics of the services? But in terms of the big picture, I think we're on the right track.
So just to clarify, Steve and I actually agreed in that answer, I think. The question is, can Medicare bring lives to the negotiation? And that's the idea of the sort of public alternative.
Bring
covered lives, I'm sorry.
Oh,
you only have negotiating leverage if you have people you're insuring, right?
Yes.
So I think that's the essential issue. And, you know, the most recent models of not accountable care, but other kinds of bundle kind of payment things organized around health systems that Medicare is doing is starting to bring in drugs and drug prices. In a weird way, that's not ideal, but still they're moving in that direction.
You know, I want to just say one quick thing, though. When we talk about value, this is actually a really slippery slope, because what I value versus what you value versus someone else may be totally different. If I have a daughter that's getting married in a month, I just want to survive that month to see her walk down the aisle, and I'll pay almost anything to see that happen. Whereas someone else would say a month is not worth $100,000. And so we got to be very careful. The reason it works in other countries is they've actually put a value price tag on a life. And unless America wants to put a value price tag on a life, you have to be very careful going down this value.
Yeah, so I want to open it up to questions, but before I do, I just want to ask you each one last question and try and answer this quickly. And I realize you're all going to say this is a ridiculous question, but let me ask it anyway. If you could change one thing in the system to make it better, what would it be, VJ?
You know, I think one of the things that the dynamic that's posed is that it's sort of companies versus the government. And that one of the things that I would love to see, and we're already seeing many examples of this, is much more partnership between the two.
Cooperation and partnership.
And so, like, you think about the CMS Medical Innovation Center, there's really amazing things coming out of that. I think we're going to see more partnership with the FDA. And that's one of the things that I think the companies that we're working with in Silicon Valley are actively doing. Is to
seeking partnership with government.
Partnership such that, and I think that's the way we can bring the best for everybody.
Steve.
So I would change international price disparity. I think if you had 600 million people funding development instead of 300 million Americans, you would see much more reasonable prices around the world.
Yeah. Peter.
No, I'm ready for value-based pricing. I think we should price drugs based on how well they work, which is what every other Western country does.
Yeah. Questions? Right over there. And please identify yourself before you ask your question.
Seth Taylor, Mass Innovation Labs. I really have a problem with people talking about drug pricing when they don't want to change the regime of regulation that causes drug prices to be where they are. The fact the United States has the most high-quality, gold standard FDA approval process, which reduces the risk of death to as low as possible, is a reason you pay so much for your drugs. That's just the bottom line. It's very expensive to run clinical trials. Everyone in the drug industry will tell you this is the case. It's not a lie. It's the truth. I personally believe that this is too much cat trap, given where we are today as a humanity, given all our devices and all the IT and all the infrastructure. We can do a lot more now than we could do 100 years ago, or 50 years ago when they made the FDA regimes. So if you want to change innovation,
you have to change the FDA.
You have to change the FDA, but you also have to change two other stakeholders. You have to change the insurance industry, who pays for this stuff. They're not going to pay for it. They don't see evidence for it. You got to say, forget about it. No evidence, you're going to pay for it anyway, because you already get the evidence. You got to be able to give money and incentives to the companies to create the data that proves this stuff actually works. So where I'm going with this is you need to create a different tier of opt-in, if you will. Patients should be able to opt in to take advantage of the next wave of technology. That means across the board. Your data should be available to anybody you want to send it to. Forget all the HIPAA requirements. You should be able to access new technology immediately. If it's not dangerous, immediately dangerous, access it. You're dying. You want it. Everybody I talk to who's got parents with cancer want their parents solved immediately.
Right.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, so let me address just the first point, right? So, and correlation and causation are not the same thing, of course, but I don't think anyone would argue that the prices of drugs at launch and over time have been rising in the U.S., and the FDA is often the whipping boy for this, but here's the facts, right? If you look at any measure of FDA friction, essentially the cost it gets to go through the FDA, they have plummeted over the last decade just as prices have risen, right? Then most cancer drugs and other specialty drugs go through these abbreviated paths. Number of patients on trial is lower. The number of randomized trials with patient-centered outcomes has fallen to near zero in cancer. Time from approval of a packet submission to actual approval has fallen. Rate of NDA submission to approval has gone from 50% to 90% in the last 8 years. There is no metric suggesting the FDA's friction has risen, yet prices have. So this whole idea that it's the FDA driving it doesn't fit with the math.
Well, I would add one thing, which is that I think there will be innovative models. So one would be for patients with terminal disease to be able to get access to drugs in phase 2. It's already been proven that it passes tox concerns, but it's at the point where if you're going to die because you're a stage 4 cancer and the drug is right there, that's something that we could do now, and especially having more data access and more transparency and just letting patients and doctors know what's available could change that dramatically.
I just want to, on the point of FDA friction not having risen, this gets back to the Moore's Law conversation. Should it have fallen? In other words, I've talked to scientists who say when we have access to the data, we can accelerate the process that the FDA puts us through from 15 years to a year or 2 years. And so that's where Moore's Law should start to play a role. Should FDA friction be falling faster than it is?
We're seeing that in some ways in terms of clinical trial design and recruitment, and especially choosing the patients carefully such that even maybe with genomic analysis, that they would be the right cohort. Yeah. I think those things are already in progress, and that should hopefully bring down the costs, but the costs are already extremely high.
Right. Yeah, so we can see no relationship between friction and costs. They are falling. I don't know if they should fall exponentially, but I mean, think ALK space, we only discovered the alteration in 2011. We have 3 agents approved for it now.
There's a question in the back. Right here, you wanted this question. Go ahead. Sorry,
Alan, Nathan Rosenberg from Insigniam.
Yeah, Nathan.
I wanted to follow up on Steve's point. It seems to me that the market's not broken. There's no market in any real sense of the word of a willing buyer and a willing seller. What would be the ideal in terms of how drugs get discovered, get paid for, the discoverer gets rewarded for the discovery? What would be the ideal marketplace?
And if you look at what most of the world has gone to, at least the Western world, it's a single-payer market because the person that's paying for the drug also benefits from the drug. So right now, our fragmented marketplace is such that, many times your health insurance will pay for a flu shot because you're going to get it during this year. They won't pay for a pneumonia vaccine because you may not get pneumonia for the next 10 years, and you may be with a different plan by then. And so the trouble is that we have to make a decision in the United States. Do we want a single-payer market with the threat that it may decrease innovation, or do we want to actually continue with what we call our free market, but then you have no control over affordability?
And quickly, what's the answer? Which do we want?
Well,
that is the question.
There's a middle ground between the two, which we're seeing, which is self-insured companies. So people switch countries very infrequently. They switch plans maybe every year, switch companies somewhere in between. And the companies have some incentive to keep their workers healthy and so on. It's not maybe a 10-year horizon, but it's much better than how quickly people change plans.
Peter, final very quick word.
Yeah, on that one, look, we haven't decided what our goal is of healthcare. I mean, and this is writ large, right? But if you back calculate from the goal of optimizing health across society because it's part of the economic fabric of everything we care about, you do end up at single payer because it's about equity and access, not about, shifts of assets to shareholders, which is the system we have now.
Gentlemen, thank you. Round of applause.